Welcome back to the Spoken Word, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Travis. I'm your host, and today we're going to be talking a little bit more about this just acknowledgement in the Old Testament, certainly, that there are, in fact, other spiritual beings besides Yahweh that both he and his covenant people interact with and are sometimes in conflict with. And we're going to be looking at a couple of specific things that, in the minds of the biblical authors, they wanted us to be aware of so that this will shape how we see the world and how we see the spiritual conflicts that happen in certainly the Old Testament, and by extension, the conflicts that the New Testament authors want us to see in the New Testament. So we talked in the last episode, just kind of framing out that there are these real spiritual beings that are Elohim was the word that we found that kind of represented that. Besides Yahweh, we established that they're not equal to him, but they do exist. They are real. They have some form of real power. And we can now move beyond that with that framework. We can fill in some more details. Okay. So let's look at a couple of points. And first, I just want you to understand that some of these entities are, as weird as it sounds, strongly tied to specific people groups, specific nations. So we're going to read from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 7 and 8. And this is coming from the mouth of Moses. He says this: "Remember the days of old. Consider the years of past generations. Ask your father, and he will tell you, your elders, and they will teach you. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance and divided the human race, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Elohim." What does that imply? He set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Elohim. Well, the sons of Elohim are angelic entities, if you want to kind of use that term. They're spiritual entities. They're created. They're subordinate to God. And this is an Old Testament title for them. They can be good or they can be bad. There's no real connotation to it. It's just a spiritual entity is what they want you to understand here. But if you are reading along in your own translation, you may say, "Now, wait a minute, that's not what my version says. Mine says that the people were divided up according to the number of the people of Israel." Well, my friends, welcome to the muddy world of Old Testament textual criticism. So the bottom line here is that we have a number of different ancient texts that we derive our modern translations from. Chiefly among those, we have the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It originated somewhere a couple hundred years before the time of Jesus, but it's written in Greek. It's not written in Hebrew. It's a translation. You also have the Dead Sea Scrolls find. So these are some very, very old texts of a whole bunch of different things, and some of what's contained in that find are some very old Hebrew texts that are from before the time of Jesus. And then you have the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is a Hebrew Old Testament, and it's written somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 to 900 years after Jesus. So certainly much more recent than the Septuagint or the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's actually in Hebrew. It's not a translation like the Septuagint is. So it's not in Greek. So you have these different texts that are floating around out there, and translators will come to these and decide, okay, which one am I going to use to then render into English or German or whatever? Well, if your Bible says that the nations were divided according to the number of the people of Israel, it's because the people that translated your Bible decided to render their main text based upon the Masoretic text, this much later Hebrew Bible, versus the older Greek Old Testament that is contained in the Septuagint. If you read this same verse in the ESV, it renders it like I did, where it says that the people were divided according to the number of the sons of God, or the angels of God, or what have you. That's because they chose to render the text based upon the Septuagint or based upon the Dead Sea Scrolls. So which one is the correct interpretation? Because this kind of has some theological implications, right? Because if the nations were divided according to the number of the sons of God, it would kind of imply, well, there's like some kind of connection between the sons of God and individual nations, right? It's like God is divvying up nations and he's assigning a support staff essentially to kind of be overseers of these nations. Well, according to Dr. Michael Heiser, the Masoretic text rendering that omits the reference to the sons of God is probably not the original. He points to both this passage in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, and further on down in the chapter in verse 43. And he says this: it's far more likely that both texts, both of these verses, were intentionally altered in the Masoretic text for the same reason, namely to eliminate a reference to heavenly beings in order to avoid allegedly polytheistic language. So the Masoretic text, according to Dr. Heiser, is most likely not what the original Hebrew said. The original Hebrew probably rendered it much as the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls rendered it, where they say that the nations were essentially divvied up according to the number of the sons of God or the angels of God. So, all that being said, we shouldn't really be super shocked by this, because even way before the time of the Masoretic text being rendered, even in the time of Jesus, we see that there are different lines of thought in Jewish theology. In the book of Acts, chapter 23, verse 8, we see a little side note that gives you, the reader, some background when it's talking about these different groups of Jews. Some are called Sadducees, some are called Pharisees, and they're just two different theological camps. And it makes the note that the Sadducees claimed that spirits and angels don't exist, and the Pharisees did claim that they existed. So it really shouldn't shock us that there's an edited version of this passage in Deuteronomy, because we see even in the first century, there was a whole thread of theology that had heartburn with the idea of a populated spiritual realm. But this is where you have to look at the textual evidence on the whole and see what renderings are the oldest, which ones are the most common, and what you come to the conclusion is that the Masoretic text is a minority view. So the original text probably said, just as I read it originally, and as the ESV renders it, that the nations were divvied up according to the number of the sons of God. So, all that being said, bottom line is that we have a biblical passage here from the mouth of Moses that suggests that nations are somehow assigned to or overseen by spiritual entities. That's at least the suggestion that's from this. Now, this really shouldn't shock anyone, because we've already seen a little bit of this pretty explicitly. We have different nations that are associated with different gods. I'll show you what I mean. So first, we've already met these characters, the unnamed powers of Egypt, right? So in Exodus 12:12, God says, before the 10th plague on the firstborn commences, he says, I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night and strike every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, both people and animals. I am Yahweh. I will execute judgments against all the Elohim of Egypt. So if God is really going to judge the Elohim of Egypt, this presupposes that there are Elohim of Egypt to judge to begin with, right? But it's interesting that somehow these Elohim are tied to Egypt specifically. So that would be very much in line with what we saw there in the Deuteronomy passage, where perhaps Egypt had been assigned to these entities or what have you. We see a similar pattern when we're talking about the gods of Canaanite nations. We see chiefly two entities, Ashtoreth and Baal, but there are certainly many others. I'll just read a selection of some passages here from other places in the Old Testament, just so we can get a list of names. And where my English text renders God or goddess or what have you, I'm just going to read that as Elohim for consistency's sake with what we've been doing, even though the actual Hebrew may have a different form of that word, like Elohe or something like that. It's all the same root word. It's all underneath the same heading in Strong's Concordance. So I'm just going to keep it like that for the sake of simplicity. Okay. So here's a passage from Judges 10:6. It says, Then the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. They worshipped the Baals and the Ashtoreths the Elohim of Aram, Sidon, and Moab, and the Elohim of the Ammonites and the Philistines. They abandoned Yahweh and did not worship him. So again, we see different entities being assigned to different nations here. Here's another passage from 1 Kings 11:33. It says, "For they have abandoned me, they have bowed down to Ashtoreth, the Elohim of the Sidonians, to Chemosh, the Elohim of Moab, to Milcom," or Molech is another term for the same entity, "the Elohim of the Ammonites. They have not walked in my ways to do what is right in my sight and to carry out my statutes and my judgments as his father David did." So again, you see specific entities being associated with very specific nations. There are some other curious passages in places like Daniel chapter 10. Basically, there's this guy named Daniel who is having these visions, and in one of these visions, an angelic messenger shows up to him, and he says, "Hey, Daniel, I would have been here sooner to answer your prayers, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me for 21 days. But then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me after I'd been left there with the kings of Persia." I have so many questions right now. Like, wait a minute, what? So that my prayer would have been answered sooner, but the messenger got waylaid because the prince of Persia opposed him for 21 days. And then Michael, who's this other angelic entity, like shows up and helps him out. Like, I have so many questions. He goes on down further in verses 20 and 21, and he says, "Do you know why I've come to you? I must return at once to fight against the prince of Persia. And when I leave, the prince of Greece will come. However, I will tell you what is recorded in the book of truth. No one has the courage to support me against those princes except Michael, your prince." So the bottom line of this passage that I want us to draw out of there is that we have some kind of angelic messenger here who gets waylaid from getting to Daniel by the quote prince of Persia. He then gets helped by Michael, who is quote unquote Daniel's prince. And therefore Michael is either the angelic prince, if you will, of Israel, or simply of the covenant community in general. Don't know. And then we have the prince of Greece that's just mentioned in passing. And the point is that at face value, since Michael is called a prince and is certainly an angelic entity, we're left to assume that these other princes are also angelic. And they, again, are associated with very specific nations. They're associated with Persia. They're associated with Greece. So as weird as that all is, there it is. We have a whole pile of texts that kind of associate spiritual beings as having some kind of correlation to human nations, human people groups. So there are a lot of spiritual entities running around out there in the Old Testament that are opposed to Yahweh, that are opposed to his spiritual agents, like we saw in this passage, and who are opposed to his people. And sometimes they even seem to have authority over nations, whatever that looks like. So all that being said, when we see Yahweh and his people coming into conflict with these entities and their people, we should be tucked away that there is a cosmic side to this whole conflict that's in the Old Testament. And when Israel wanders away from Yahweh, we should not just look at that and be like, "Oh, wow, look at what a bunch of dummies. They just ran off on Yahweh and they're over here worshiping rocks." No, they're being attracted to something that's very real, something that's inferior to Yahweh, but is still very real. So that's my first point. Some of these entities are spiritual stewards of nations, it seems. And apparently, seemingly most or all of them are somehow in conflict with Yahweh and his people. So that's my first point. Second point is that there is a connection between the worship of these dark powers and the development of occult practices. So this is coming from Deuteronomy again, and this is in the 12th chapter, verses 29 through 32. And this is what it says: "When Yahweh, your Elohim, annihilates the nations before you," this is Moses talking about Israel going in and conquering the promised land, "which you are entering to take possession of, you will drive them out and live in their land, Be careful not to be ensnared by their ways after they have been destroyed before you. Do not inquire about their gods, asking, how did these nations worship their gods? I'll do the same. You must not do the same to Yahweh, your Elohim, because they practice every detestable act which Yahweh hates for their Elohim. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their Elohim. Be careful to do everything I command you. Do not add anything to it or take anything away from it. So again, I'm beating a dead horse here, I feel like, but notice the language of Yahweh, your Elohim, as opposed to their Elohim, right? These other gods aren't even named here. It's just, whatever it is that they worship. So that's one passage here. So there's this idea that these nations practice detestable things, and it's somehow in relationship to the worship of these other Elohim. Now, a couple chapters later in Deuteronomy 18, verses 9 through 14, Moses gives a little bit more details on what types of things these people are doing. And he says, when you enter the land Yahweh your Elohim is giving you, do not imitate the detestable customs of those nations. No one among you is to sacrifice his son or daughter in the fire, practice divination, tell fortunes, interpret omens, practice sorcery, cast spells, consult a medium or a spiritist, or inquire the dead. Everyone who does these acts is detestable to Yahweh, and Yahweh your Elohim is driving out the nations before you because of these detestable acts. You must be blameless before Yahweh your Elohim. Though these nations you are about to drive out listen to fortune tellers and diviners, Yahweh your Elohim has not permitted you to do this. Okay? So these nations that are worshiping these other Elohim, they are practicing all this kind of occult stuff, sorcery, spellcasting, spiritist, medium, inquiry of the dead, all this kind of stuff, right? So that's what they're doing. And it's in connection with these entities. More importantly, these things are real. These practices, powers, whatever you want to call them, they're real. And that's a biblical claim. If you read through Exodus 7 and 8, for example, you'll meet the sorcerers of Egypt, the Egyptian magicians, right? And they are able to replicate some of what Moses and Aaron do by the power of God, but they're doing it, quote, by their occult practices. So Moses, who we presume is the author of Exodus, he draws a very specific distinction between the source of their powers. He's like, I don't want you to think that the magicians of Egypt were able to do what we did by Yahweh's power. No, they're doing some dark occult thing. They're dark arts, they're magic arts, they're occult practices, however your text renders it. So we see these guys being able to render their staves into snakes. We see them turn water into blood, and we see them call frogs out of the Nile River. Those are all things that Moses and Aaron did, and every single time that the magicians replicate this, it says that they were able to do the same thing, quote, by their occult practices. So after this, they're not able to replicate other things that Yahweh does. But the point is that they are, in fact, able to do some things, and it's by these occult practices that they do them. So it's not just sleight of hand. No, there's some kind of real power that they're tapping into here. And I think you're supposed to assume that just as Yahweh is empowering Moses and Aaron to do these things, I think you're supposed to be have it in your mind that there is some unnamed power behind the Egyptians as well. And that would certainly be in line with God eventually mentioning that, he's going to judge the Elohim of Egypt. And I think that it's like, oh, okay, that's the powers that are behind this we're supposed to be thinking of. So regardless, point being, these guys are practicing occult stuff and they're able to get actual results from that. Okay, so this is not just make-believe. But that's not the only place. Here's one of the weirdest stories in the Bible. And this is the story of the witch of Endor, or the witch at Endor. And this is in the book of 1 Samuel. So there's this prophet who's named Samuel. He's like an advisor to the people of Israel and to their early kings. By this point, he's died. And it says this: By this time Samuel had died. All Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his city. And Saul, who is the king of Israel at this time, he had removed the mediums and spiritists from the land. The Philistines gathered and camped at Shunem. So the Philistines are one of these opposing groups of people that are in the land of Canaan, and they were opposed to Israel as they're entering into that land and trying to take it over. So the Philistines show up, and it says that Saul gathered all Israel and they camped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine camp, he was afraid and his heart pounded. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him in dreams or by the Urim or by the prophets. Saul then said to his servants, Find me a woman who is a medium so I can go and consult her. His servants replied, There is a woman at Endor who is a medium. Saul disguised himself by putting on different clothes and set out with two of his men. They came to the woman at night, and Saul said, Consult the spirit for me. Bring up for me the one I tell you. But the woman said, You surely know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why are you setting a trap for me to get me killed? Then Saul swore to her by the Lord, As surely as the Lord lives, no punishment will come to you from this. Who is it that you want me to bring up for you? The woman asked. Bring up Samuel for me, he answered. When the woman saw Samuel, she screamed, and then she asked Saul, Why did you deceive me? You are Saul. But the king said to her, Don't be afraid. What do you see? I see a spirit coming up out of the earth. The woman answered. Then Saul asked her, What does he look like? An old man is coming up, she replied. He's wearing a robe. Then Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he knelt low with his face to the ground and paid homage. Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Samuel asked Saul. I'm in serious trouble, replied Saul. The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. He doesn't answer me anymore, even though the prophets or in dreams. So I've called on you to tell me what to do. So bottom line of the story is that Saul goes to one of these spiritists, and something actually happens when she does her thing, whatever that is. What she does in very good biblical fashion, her practice is completely omitted from the story. It just says that when she saw Samuel, she screamed, right? Saul says, Bring up Samuel for me. Then the next sentence, when the woman saw Samuel. So it completely omits any details of these occult practices. And with good reason. This is not a valid way to interact with the world. And there's certainly dark powers that are being tapped into here. So, but the point is that this really happened. And it's not something that was through God's power or something like that. The other thing that we see are prophecies being performed through the power of some of these entities. So this is in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 2, verse 8, and then we'll look at chapter 23, verse 13. And they kind of say the same thing. It says, The priests quit asking, Where is the Lord? The experts in the law no longer knew me, and the rulers rebelled against me. The prophets prophesied by Baal and followed useless idols. The second one there says, Among the prophets of Samaria, I saw something disgusting. They prophesied by Baal and led my people astray. So we see that these prophets that Jeremiah is talking about here, we're seeing them giving their prophecies by Baal. So in Jeremiah's brain, the source of their prophecies is this entity known as Baal. So in Jeremiah's mind, Baal is real and he has real power. And that's being manifested as these prophets that are prophesying. So again, the occult is real in some sense. We even see similar things in the New Testament where we see kind of what we were calling miraculous things that have a dark origin. So this isn't just locked in the Old Testament. We see the story of a group of demons in Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. And this guy who is like possessed by these demons, he is like living out alone among the tombs. And it says that no one was able to restrain him anymore, not even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he had torn the chains apart and smashed the shackles. So he has this like supernatural strength that's given to him as part of this possession. We see in the book of Acts, chapter 16, verses 16 through 18, that there is a young girl who, just like we saw with the prophets of Baal, is somehow this vessel by which dark entities will speak through her and will do fortune telling and stuff. It says that once, as we were on our way to prayer, a slave girl met us who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. She made a large profit for her owners by fortune telling. As she followed Paul and us, she cried out, "These men who are proclaiming to you a way of salvation are the servants of the Most High God." She did this for many days. Paul was greatly annoyed. Turning to the spirit, he said, "I command you to come out of her in the name of Jesus Christ." And it came out right away. So again, even in the New Testament, we see things like prophecy. We see this like great strength that this one guy has that are all connected to these dark spiritual forces. So why does any of this matter? The reason that it matters is that the New Testament authors want us to understand something about the world that we live in. Jesus assumed his followers were in conflict with spiritual forces when he sent out the 72 of his followers, and he was like, go out, spread the gospel, cast out demons, all this kind of stuff. It says in Luke 10:17-20, it says, when the 72 returned with joy, saying, "Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name," he said to them, "I watched Satan fall from heaven like lightning." When? Just now, when you guys were out doing your things. He says, "Look, I've given you the authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy. Nothing at all will harm you. However, don't rejoice that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice their names are written in heaven." In John 17:14-15, speaking of his disciples, in this prayer that he prays, Jesus says that I have given them your word. He's praying to the Father. He's praying to God. He says, I've given them your word. The world hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I'm not praying that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. So Jesus assumes that his followers are going to need some kind of protection from, quote, the evil one. Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, also assumed a cosmic conflict. He said in Ephesians 6:12, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this darkness, against evil spiritual forces in the heavens. So that's just from the mouth of Paul. He's like, this is our conflict. It's against spiritual forces of evil, not just against people. Peter assumed that there is, in fact, an enemy of your soul who must be opposed. And he assumed the rulership of the devil over people's lives up to this point in history. When he's writing, he is speaking to a Roman soldier in Acts 10:37-38. And he says that, the events that took place throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee after the baptism that John preached, how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power, and how he went out doing good and healing all who were under the tyranny of the devil because God was with him. So in Peter's brain, there's a real force out there called the devil, and he had tyranny. He had power over people, and Jesus was out breaking down that power, essentially. He later in life writes to a number of people in the letter, and he tells them, be sober-minded, be alert. Your adversary, the devil, is prowling around like a roaring lion, looking for anyone he can devour. Resist him, firm in the faith, knowing that the same kind of sufferings are being experienced by your fellow believers throughout the world. So these are just a few of the places in the New Testament that this same cosmic conflict kind of idea is being preserved. So this is not just a New Testament idea. This is not just an Old Testament idea. It's a Bible through and through kind of idea. So all that being said, what are some take-homes? First of all, I want you to understand that paganism is not and never has been make-believe. There is reality to it. And you completely defang all these passages if you choose to deny that. It is a solid biblical claim that there's way more to this than just people bowing down to a rock. And that is why both the Old and New Testament are so bent out of shape about it. The other takeaway is that dark spiritual forces are real, and they are opposed to Yahweh and his people. Just as in ancient times, they are a power that is influencing people who are outside of the covenant community. just as Baal or Ashtoreth or Molech or whoever had influence over the Canaanites, so now such forces probably oppress your neighbor in some way, whether or not they know it, no matter how subtle it is. For those who are outside of the covenant community, there is not protection for these things. So I want to end this section on that note, just sitting with the gravity of what this means, that there are these real entities and there is a real conflict, and we have a war to engage in if you're a believer. And in our next episode, I want to kind of close up this topic and move on. And we're going to talk about the means by which God's people engage in this conflict, because I don't want you to be left thinking that these are things you need to be scared of. Rather, these are things that Christ has already conquered. And these are things that he has given his people the power to also conquer. So with that, I hope you've learned something from this. I hope that you sit with these ideas for a while, that you look through the entirety of the Bible and make your own conclusions. But thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. But until then, God bless you and keep you.